The millionaire father pushed open the grand oak door and froze as if the ground had been ripped from beneath him, because in the middle of the polished marble floor, his little 6-year-old daughter was huddled against the wall, clutching her 8-month-old baby brother in her thin, trembling arms. Her tattered pink dress stained and torn, her messy brown hair falling into her tear-stained face as she sobbed desperately, "Please don't hurt me and my brother anymore." And those words split the silence of the mansion like thunder, tearing apart the illusion of elegance and revealing the nightmare hidden inside these gilded walls. A nightmare of cruelty, of secret threats, and of betrayal that festered not outside but within his very own home. Samuel Walker, once celebrated in glossy magazines as a tech millionaire and a symbol of success, stood rooted in horror as the cries of his children cracked the armor he had built around his grief. Because behind them loomed Veronica, the woman he had trusted to be their stepmother, her tight red dress shimmering in the chandelier's glow, her painted smile sharp and cold, her voice like a knife dripping venom into the fragile hearts of the children he had abandoned to her care. For a moment, Samuel could not breathe. He could not move, his guilt and his fear chaining him to the floor, but the sight of Emily's small shoulders shaking and Michael's tiny fist clinging desperately to her sleeve ignited something fierce inside him, and with a sudden hoarse cry he stepped forward, shielding them with his own body, his voice breaking the spell. "Enough! You will not speak to them that way again." Veronica's eyes flashed, the sweetness slipping back over her face like a mask. And in that instant, Samuel realized how blind he had been, how far he had drifted, and how easily the walls of wealth had hidden the cries of his children. That moment was not only the collapse of silence, but the beginning of a reckoning. For the truth that had been whispered in shadows was about to roar into the light, and nothing inside this house would remain the same. This is the story of a father learning to be a father again, of a little girl who carried courage larger than her years, and of a family scarred by betrayal yet destined for healing. A story that will remind us that the good must be protected and the wicked will pay their price. If you believe in the power of heartwarming stories, in tales of justice, healing, and the triumph of love, then stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear may stir the deepest places of your heart. Samuel Walker was 43 years old, and to the world he was the image of triumph, the kind of man whose sharp suits and gleaming watches were praised in business journals, the kind of name whispered with respect in boardrooms. A millionaire who had climbed from humble beginnings to the top of New York's skyline, sitting in his office at Central Park Tower signing contracts beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet behind that polished glass was a man hollowed by loss. Years earlier, he had known a different life, filled with warmth, laughter, and a wife whose name was Sarah. She was the kind of woman who filled silence with music, whose hands carried softness into every corner of their home, and whose love transformed Samuel from a restless worker into a father who once rocked his infant daughter to sleep at 2 in the morning. Their firstborn, Emily, had inherited Sarah's gentle eyes and soft brown hair. And when she was born, Samuel had learned to be careful and tender, sterilizing bottles, counting her breaths as though each one were a fragile treasure. Then came the day of Michael's birth, meant to be a new beginning, but instead it became a fracture. Sarah had slipped away in childbirth, leaving behind an infant boy and a husband unprepared to walk through grief. The silence after her passing was unbearable. Samuel could not look at his children without seeing Sarah's reflection, and so he fled, not with his feet, but with his hours, losing himself in meetings, airports, and endless numbers. The children were left behind in the care of others, while Samuel convinced himself he was providing, when in truth he was running. It was in that broken season that Veronica entered his world. She had once been Sarah's friend, standing at the edges of hospital rooms with sympathetic smiles, her presence gentle when Samuel was collapsing. Her beauty was undeniable, tall with golden hair perfectly styled, her voice soft and honeyed. To a man drowning, she seemed like salvation. When she became his second wife, Samuel thought he had secured stability for Emily and Michael. To him, she looked like devotion, a woman who soothed, who smiled, who carried herself like a perfect stepmother. But to the children, her sweetness was a mask, and when Samuel's back was turned, The mask slipped. Veronica's hands were not tender, but harsh, her discipline laced with threats, her voice sharpened into something venomous. Emily, barely 6, became her target. Her chores were endless, her mistakes punished with cold words or locked doors. And the cruelest dagger of all was the warning that if she ever dared to speak to her father, she and her baby brother would be thrown into the street. To Emily, those words were not just threats, they were a prison. Her world shrank to the size of protecting Michael, shielding him from hunger and fear, carrying him in her small arms when she was barely strong enough to hold herself. Michael, only 8 months old, too young to speak, cried for milk that was often thinned with water, his tiny fists waving in the dark as Emily whispered lullabies she barely remembered from her mother's voice. Mrs. Whitman, the old housekeeper who had served the family since Sarah's days, saw fragments of the truth but was bound by fear of losing her position, her heart torn between loyalty and helplessness. And Samuel, blinded by grief and distance, never looked closely enough. He told himself the children were safe, that Veronica's strictness was discipline, that silence was normal. But the bruises on Emily's wrists, the trembling in her voice, and the hunger in Michael's cries painted another story, one that Samuel had refused to see. That was the wound at the heart of this family. A father absent, a daughter carrying burdens too heavy, a baby suffering silently, and a woman who wore love like a mask while harboring greed and resentment beneath. The following days unfolded like a slow tightening rope around Samuel's chest. For though the mansion looked the same, its silence had changed, and once he had heard his daughter's sobs, he could no longer pretend not to notice. At dinner, he sat at the head of the table, Veronica poised to his right, Emily across from him, with her eyes fixed on her bowl, and Michael in a small chair still too young to hold his own spoon. Veronica's smile was flawless, her voice smooth as silk as she ladled soup and placed a piece of chicken on Emily's plate, saying sweetly, "Eat, darling, so you'll grow strong." Yet Samuel saw how her hand lingered on the girl's shoulder, pressing just a fraction too firmly, enough to make Emily flinch and drop her spoon. A faint bruise circled her thin wrist like a shadow of chains. Samuel's throat tightened. "Has anyone at school been rough with you?" he asked slowly, trying not to sound calm. But Emily's eyes flickered in panic before darting down, her voice barely more than air. "No, Father." Veronica laughed lightly, brushing the concern aside. "Children fall. They bump into things. You know how clumsy she can be." But Samuel's ears caught every tremor in his daughter's tone, and the denial pierced him deeper than any confession. That night, as he carried Michael upstairs, he heard again the echo of Veronica's low hiss from the stairwell, sharp as broken glass. "If you tell him, both of you will be out on the street." He froze, his hand gripping the banister, his heart slamming as Emily's choked whisper answered, "Please, I won't say anything." Rage surged in him, but so did fear. Fear of breaking the fragile courage his daughter clung to, fear of exploding without proof and leaving them more exposed than before. He pressed his lips tight, swallowing a storm. Samuel began to watch more carefully. He noticed the way Emily dragged her feet when walking past Veronica, the way she pulled her sleeve down quickly whenever he entered the room, the way Michael cried louder when Veronica lifted him than when anyone else did. Mrs. Whitman moved like a shadow through the halls, her eyes meeting Samuel's just long enough to whisper silent warnings she dared not voice aloud. Samuel carried his guilt like a stone in his chest. Each night he sat in his study, staring at the photograph of Sarah, her gentle smile frozen in silver, and he heard her imagined voice. "Protect them," he whispered back into the silence. "I will. I swear I will." Yet when morning came and Veronica moved gracefully through the halls, pouring coffee, arranging roses, speaking of investments and schedules, Samuel's courage faltered beneath her practiced composure. The tension coiled tighter. Emily became more withdrawn, her small shoulders slumping as though she carried invisible weight. When she thought no one was looking, she pressed her face into her teddy bear, whispering words only the worn toy could hear. Samuel longed to kneel beside her, to pull the truth from her silence, but every time Veronica's shadow passed across the room, the girl shrank, sealing her lips. The storm inside the mansion was building, invisible to outsiders. yet undeniable to those who lived within its walls. And Samuel knew that the longer he waited, the heavier the price would become. That night Samuel could not sleep. The echo of Emily's trembling whisper clung to his ears, and the sight of her bruised wrist burned behind his eyes like a scar he could not turn away from. He walked the hallway alone, the lights dimmed to a faint amber, and stopped outside the room that had remained locked since Sarah's death. For months he had avoided it, afraid of memories, afraid of facing the truth of what he had lost. But now, with his children trembling in the shadows of cruelty, he felt Sarah calling him back. His hands shook as he opened the drawer where he had hidden the key, then slid it into the lock. The door opened with a soft click, and a wave of air carrying her faint perfume rushed toward him. Inside the room, everything remained untouched. A shawl draped over the chair, a photograph on the vanity, a silver frame holding the smile of the woman who once filled this house with warmth. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, his breath uneven. Then his eyes caught a thin envelope lying in the drawer, the front marked with Sarah's familiar handwriting. To Samuel. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the letter. The words seemed to breathe her voice into the air. If I am no longer here, please protect Emily and Michael. Do not place your trust too quickly in anyone. Believe in your child's eyes. When she is afraid, she will not know how to lie. Each sentence pierced deeper than the last. Samuel's chest tightened with grief and shame. He pressed the letter against his heart, whispering, I failed you, Sarah, but I will not fail again. He stood, his steps unsteady, and opened the small jewelry box Sarah once kept on the nightstand. Inside were a few pieces she had treasured, but one was missing, the pearl necklace she loved most. Samuel closed his eyes, recalling the image of Veronica wearing it boldly at dinner, as if claiming not only his home but the memory of the woman who had come before her. He clenched his fists. The disguise was cracking. Later downstairs, Samuel poured himself a glass of water, but the silence broke when he heard voices from Veronica's study. The door was slightly ajar, light spilling out. He froze and listened. Veronica's tone, stripped of its sweetness, was sharp and hurried. He's weak. Just a little longer. The signature is all I need. Samuel's blood ran cold. Another voice answered from the other end of the call, muffled but unmistakably male. The words fragmented, but the meaning was clear. She was scheming for more than control of his children. She wanted the family trust, the wealth he and Sarah had built, the fortune meant to safeguard Emily and Michael's future. Samuel stepped back into the shadows, his mind reeling, his heart pounding with both fury and clarity. Everything he had dismissed as paranoia was now undeniable. His daughter's cries were not childish exaggerations. They were warnings. The bruises, the locked doors, the trembling silence, all of it was truth. A truth he had refused to see until now. He pressed Sarah's letter deeper into his pocket, its words burning like a command. Believe in your child's eyes. For the first time in months, Samuel felt the fog inside him lift. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow he would call Richard Coleman, his trusted attorney, and begin the process of unmasking Veronica's cruelty, not with anger alone, but with evidence strong enough to shatter her lies in court. He returned to the living room where Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body curled protectively around Michael. Samuel knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, wide and frightened. But when they met his, they softened with a flicker of hope. He whispered gently, I'm here. You don't have to be afraid anymore. And though his heart still ached with guilt, he knew this was the turning point, the line he would not cross back over. From this moment forward, Samuel Walker would not be only a businessman, not only a man of wealth. He would be a father in the truest sense, one who stood, one who fought, one who loved. Dear listener, if this story has touched something inside you, if you believe that every child deserves protection and every cruelty deserves to be exposed, then stay with us because the next chapter will show just how far a father can go to defend the ones he loves and how justice, though slow, always finds its way into the light. The following evening, Samuel sat at the long dining table, his posture straighter than it had been in months, his eyes sharp with a resolve that frightened even himself. Across from him, Veronica moved gracefully, her red dress clinging perfectly, her every gesture rehearsed. She poured wine into crystal glasses, the red liquid shimmering like a performance. Emily sat in silence, her spoon untouched, Michael cooing weakly in his chair. Mrs. Whitman stood quietly in the corner, her hands clasped tightly, as though sensing the storm about to break. Samuel had spent the day with Richard Coleman, his trusted attorney, going through trust documents, guardianship clauses, and reviewing every piece of evidence they could gather. The pearl necklace, the bruises, the letter, the overheard conversation, each thread woven together into a rope strong enough to pull truth from shadow. But tonight was not yet court. Tonight was confrontation. He cleared his throat, his voice steady. Emily has a bruise on her wrist. Explain it. The words fell heavy into the silence. Veronica did not flinch. Instead, she gave a light laugh, tilting her head with practiced charm. Children fall, Samuel. She's clumsy. You know this. Samuel's jaw tightened. Not like that. Not marks shaped like fingers. Veronica's smile thinned, her eyes flashing before she masked them again. Are you accusing me? Her voice rose, but only just enough to be dramatic. She reached for her glass, setting it down with a sharp click. I have been here every day while you were off in your tower, traveling on business, leaving me to care for Sarah's children. And now you insult me? Samuel leaned forward, his voice cold as steel. I'm not insulting you. I'm stating the truth I see with my own eyes. Emily flinches every time you touch her. Michael cries louder in your arms than in anyone else's. And I have heard the threats, word for word. Veronica froze for half a second, then forced a dry laugh, though the edges of her facade cracked. Threats? Really? Children imagine things. They exaggerate. Perhaps she resents me because she clings to her dead mother's memory, and you let her. Samuel's hands slammed against the table, rattling the silverware. Enough! I found Sarah's letter. She warned me. She told me to trust my daughter's eyes, and I see the fear in them every single day. For the first time, Veronica's face twisted into something raw and venomous. She spat the words like poison. Of course she's afraid. Every time I look at her, I see Sarah's ghost staring back at me, reminding me I will never be enough. Do you think I married you for love? No, Samuel, I married you for power, for the life you could give me. And every time that girl opens her mouth, it feels like Sarah mocking me from the grave. Emily gasped softly, shrinking against her chair. Samuel's chest burned with fury. He rose to his feet, pointing a finger at Veronica, his voice shaking but firm. You call yourself a mother. Sarah taught our children with kindness, not cruelty. She comforted them. She sang to them. She loved them. And you locked doors. You watered down milk. You twisted their silence into a weapon. You are not their mother. You are a coward who hurts children to feed her emptiness. Veronica's mask shattered. She slammed her hand on the table, wine splashing across the white cloth. Do you think anyone will believe you? You were gone for months. I raised them. I fed them. You think the courts will choose you, the absent father, over me, the legal wife? You will lose everything. Samuel's eyes burned, but his voice steadied into a cold, measured tone. I would lose fortune, reputation, everything I own, but I will not lose my children again. I will fight you in court. I will expose every lie, and I will never let you near them. Veronica's lips curled into a cruel smile, but beneath it flickered the faint glimmer of fear. Samuel reached down, lifted Emily into his arms despite her stiffness, and with his other hand cradled Michael against his chest. You will not touch them again, he said softly but firmly. The house fell silent, except for the trembling breath of a child clinging to her father's shirt. In that silence, Samuel knew the war had only just begun, but for the first time in years, he was no longer running. He was standing, and Veronica, staring at him with eyes full of fury, understood that the ground beneath her feet had shifted forever. The morning after the confrontation, Samuel rose before dawn, the letter from Sarah still pressed against his chest like a commandment. He brewed strong coffee, then dialed Richard Coleman's number with steady hands. By mid-morning, Richard was in his study, briefcase heavy with files, his expression calm but piercing. We need to act quickly, Samuel said, his voice firm. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Richard opened his notes, his tone low and measured. I've seen this before, Samuel. Abusers thrive in silence. But with testimony, photographs, and Sarah's letter, we can build a case. I'll petition for an emergency protective order and file for temporary custody. We'll bring in child services for immediate safety. Samuel nodded, his jaw clenched. Do it! That afternoon, Sheriff Dalton and social worker Carla Reyes stepped across the mansion's threshold. Veronica's smile faltered when they introduced themselves, their badges shining beneath the chandelier. We are here to investigate a report of child endangerment, Carla announced. Veronica's eyes darted towards Samuel, her voice dripping with artificial calm. This is absurd. I love those children. Ask anyone. My husband knows I take care of them. But Samuel's eyes did not waver. No more lies, Veronica. The truth has a voice now. Carla knelt down gently before Emily, who stood frozen with her teddy bear pressed to her chest. Sweetheart, you don't have to be afraid. You can tell me anything you want. Emily's lips trembled, her gaze flicking to her father. Samuel lowered himself to her level, extending his hand slowly. I'm here, Emily. Whatever you say, I will believe you. Tears pooled in her wide eyes as she whispered, barely audible. She said if I told you, she would throw us out, but I can't stay quiet anymore. Please protect us. Carla's hand rested lightly on the child's shoulder. Thank you, brave girl. That's enough for today. Sheriff Dalton turned to Veronica, his voice stern. You are under investigation for threats and neglect. You'll need to come with us for questioning. Veronica's mask shattered. She lashed out with venom. You will regret this, Samuel. Without me, this house is nothing. These children are nothing. Her words echoed off the marble walls, but for the first time they did not pierce Samuel's heart. He held Emily close with one arm and Michael in the other, whispering into their hair, You are everything. You are my life. The days that followed were filled with hearings, statements, and restless nights, but each step brought a thread of light into the darkness. Richard stood beside Samuel in court, presenting Sarah's letter, Mrs. Whitman's testimony, and photographs of Emily's bruises. Carla spoke calmly about the children's fear, the hunger, the threats whispered in hallways. The judge's eyes softened when Emily took the stand, her small voice breaking but steady enough to say, I don't want my brother to grow up in fear. The gavel struck and the protective order was granted. Veronica was removed from the house, barred from contact until trial. Samuel felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders, though the battle was not yet complete. At home, healing began in fragile steps. Samuel rearranged his schedule, declining major deals, telling his partners bluntly, my family comes first. He cooked simple meals with Emily by his side, letting her stir the pot and sprinkle spices. He held Michael longer than he ever had, rocking him to sleep with lullabies he once sang with Sarah. Mrs. Whitman remained, her quiet presence like a steady guardian angel, bringing tea to Samuel's desk and gently reminding him when the children needed fresh air or a story before bed. Therapy sessions with Carla helped Emily name her feelings. Fear is gray, she said one afternoon, but safety is yellow. Samuel held her hand and promised, then I'll make sure your world has more yellow. At night, he repeated the words that had become his vow. Today I am here. Tomorrow I will still be here. Slowly, the children began to believe it. For the first time in months, laughter returned to the house, not loud but steady. Emily began practicing piano again, her small fingers pressing tentative notes that grew stronger with each day. Michael learned to toddle across the rug, his giggles filling the silence that once suffocated them all. Samuel would sit in the living room watching them, his heart aching with both regret and gratitude, whispering into the quiet, Sarah, I kept the promise. A year later, the Walker house no longer echoed with fear, but with music and gentle laughter. In the corner of the living room stood an upright piano donated by a neighbor, its keys worn yet shining with new life. Emily sat before it in a pale blue dress, her small hands steady now, pressing each note with care. Beside her, Michael clapped his chubby hands in delight, shouting his little brother's joy. Samuel watched from the sofa, his chest rising with pride and relief. The children were no longer shadows hiding in corners. They were sunlight returning after a long storm. Healing had not come in a single moment, but in hundreds of small ones. Bedtime stories whispered softly, warm meals cooked together, therapy sessions where fear was slowly unthreaded. Emily's eyes, once clouded with terror, now carried light, and Michael's laughter filled every silence that once felt unbearable. Samuel had not erased the past, but he had chosen each day to live differently, to stand, to protect, and to love without retreat. On an evening golden with sunset, Emily looked up from the piano and asked, her voice tender, "Daddy, are you happy now?" Samuel knelt beside her, touching her hand lightly. "Yes, Emily, because I am here, and I will always be here." For a moment he thought he felt Sarah's presence, like a quiet blessing drifting through the air. Not in sorrow, but in peace. The garden outside bloomed with tomatoes and flowers, tended by small hands that once trembled, but now reached confidently toward the light. Life was not perfect, but it was true, and it was theirs. Dear listener, this story is not only about wealth or betrayal, it is about the courage of a child who spoke the truth, and a father who chose to rise again. Perhaps you have known moments where silence weighed heavy, where fear hid behind closed doors. Let this remind you that love, when chosen, has the power to change everything. If this journey touched your heart, share it so others may find strength. Subscribe to our channel for more timeless stories of healing, justice, and family love, because together we can keep hope alive for every child who still waits to be heard.